Imagine this. The year is 1241. Mongol cavalry is trampling the streets of Paris. The Pope is fleeing Rome. London is burning. This never happened, but it could have. And if it had, the modern world would look completely different. Stay until the end. I'll tell you exactly how. In the spring of 1241, Mongol armies under the command of Khan Batu and his chief general, the brilliant strategist Subutai, accomplished in a matter of weeks what seemed impossible. They annihilated the combined Polish-German forces at Legnica, and that same month utterly destroyed the Hungarian army at the Sejo River. 2 strikes, 2 crushing defeats. Between the Mongol Tumans and Paris, there was no longer a single serious armed force standing in the way. All of Central Europe froze in panic. Refugees from Poland and Hungary brought horrifying accounts. Cities emptied overnight. Armies vanished within hours. The enemy could neither be outrun nor stopped. French King Louis IX ordered the fortification of castles. Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade. An English chronicler recorded that people were afraid to go out to sea, as if even the fishermen sensed that something terrible was sweeping in from the east. And then a halt, sudden, inexplicable to those who witnessed it. The great Khan Ogdi had died in his capital of Karakorum. By Mongol law, all Chinggisids were required to return for the Kurultai, the assembly, to elect a new ruler. Batu struck his tents, and the cavalry rode east. Europe was saved, but not by the valor of its knights or the prayers of its monks. It was saved by the death of one aging man thousands of kilometers from Din. But what if Ogdi had lived another 5 years? What if the Kurultai had simply been delayed? What if Subutai had been given permission to press on? That is the question where today's journey begins. Subutai. This is a name worth remembering. He was arguably the greatest military commander of his era, and perhaps in all of world military history. Not a single defeat in 40 years of command. He fought in the steppes of Central Asia, in the mountains of the Caucasus, on the plains of Rus, in the forests of Poland. He knew how to adapt to any enemy and any terrain. And he wasn't finished yet. Had Ogdi survived, Subutai would have continued what he had started. In the spring of 1242, the Mongol armies would have marched west. Austria, Bohemia, northern Italy. Each of these lands, on its own, could not have withstood what had already broken the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Rus princes combined. Venice, a city on the water that had always felt safe, would have watched its mainland territories burn. The Mongols had no fleet to take islands, but all the coastlines, all the ports, all the trade routes would have fallen into their hands. Pope Innocent IV, the same man who in real history fled to Lyon a few years later, not from steppe horsemen, but from the German Emperor Frederick II, would now have been fleeing from the east with nowhere nearly as safe to go. A crusade. The Pope declares a holy war. But who would answer the call? France and England were locked in their traditional rivalry. The Holy Roman Empire was torn between hundreds of petty princes, each thinking first of his own castle. The Iberian Peninsula was consumed by its own internal war, the Reconquista against the Moors. The Crusaders ride out, and they meet somewhere beneath the walls of a Burgundian town, the very thing from which all of Central Europe had been fleeing. Mongol tactics were nothing like what European knights were trained for. There are no 2 armies lining up across from each other and fighting until one broke. Instead, there was a feigned retreat that lured you into an encirclement. There were storms of arrows fired from distances where a heavily armored knight simply could not respond. There was light cavalry appearing from the flanks at exactly the moment you believed you were winning. The heavy French cavalry, the finest in Europe, was useless against an enemy who simply refused to fight the battle it had prepared for. By 1244 or 1245, the Mongols stood before the walls of Paris. The city surrendered after a week-long siege. Louis IX, the future saint of the Catholic Church, found himself a prisoner of steppe nomads. The Pope sailed to Sicily, the one island the Mongols truly could not reach without a fleet. There, in Palermo, he would continue issuing papal bulls into the void because there was no longer anyone left to carry them out. But here it is important to understand something that is often forgotten when people speak of the Mongols. They were not simply destroyers. Yes, they killed. Yes, cities that resisted were annihilated. And this was a deliberate tactic of terror, so that the next city would surrender without a fight. But where people submitted, the Mongols built. Their model of governance had been tested on dozens of conquered peoples. Leave local rulers in place as vassals, collect tribute, guarantee the security of trade routes, and live off the wealth that commerce produces. To destroy Paris meant losing a source of tribute. To preserve Paris meant having income every year. The Mongols were arguably the most religiously tolerant state in the medieval world. Among the Mongol Khans and their families, one could find Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, and shamanists living side by side. They imposed no faith of their own, because they had none compelling enough to impose. For 13th century Europe, this would have meant something extraordinary. On a single marketplace in conquered Krakow, a Catholic monk, a Sufi mystic from Bokhara, a Jewish merchant from Mainz, and a Buddhist friar from eastern Turkestan could all stand together and all be equally legitimate subjects of the Great Khan. The Inquisition, which was just gaining strength in the real Europe of the 1230s, would have had no foundation on which to stand. Not because the Mongols were humanists, but because religious persecution was bad for business. And business was what the Mongols understood and valued above all else. The Great Silk Road now ran from Beijing through Samarkand, Karakorum, Kiev, Krakow, and onward to Lyon and Lisbon. Merchants could travel from the Yellow Sea to the Atlantic under the protection of the Mongol Yam system, a network of postal relay stations where one could change horses, rest for the night, and receive an escort to the next station. In real history, Marco Polo made use of exactly this system. But in our scenario, there would have been thousands of travelers like him, riding not only east but west as well. So what would have happened to Europe itself under the Mongol yoke? The feudal system, that pyramidal structure of kings, dukes, counts, barons, and serfs that had held Europe together for centuries, would have received a fatal blow. The Mongols did not understand and did not respect European hierarchies. For them, only two categories of people existed: those who paid tribute and those who did not. Duke or serf, if you paid, you lived. If not, the same fate awaited you both. This destroyed the entire logic of feudal society. What did it mean that "my lord protects me" when your lord himself was paying tribute to a Mongol governor and could do nothing without his permission? The protective function of the feudal lord disappeared, and with it, the moral justification for the entire system. In its place, a new class was rising. Merchants, interpreters, people who knew how to negotiate across cultural and linguistic boundaries. These became genuinely indispensable in this new, blended world. Not the sword and not the prayer, but knowledge of Arabic, Turkic, or Mongol, and the ability to trade across frontiers gave real power and real status. This would have been an early, very early seed of what we would later call capitalism, not born from Europe's internal development, but forced into being by an external blow that shattered the old structure. The Catholic Church, the most powerful institution of the medieval West, the one that crowned and deposed kings, found itself in profound crisis. The papacy on Sicily would have continued to exist, but as a shadow of its former self. Papal decrees would not have been enforced where Mongol governors ruled. Church lands would have become subjects of dispute with the new authority. Bishops, without the protection of their former kings, would have been forced to negotiate and compromise. But the most fascinating question of all was what would have happened to the Renaissance. In real history, the Renaissance was born in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, and this was no accident. Italy was the most urbanized part of Europe, the most commercially active, the most connected through the Mediterranean to the legacy of the ancient world and to Arab science. Florence, Venice, and Genoa had accumulated enough capital and leisure to finance art, philosophy, and scholarship. But in our scenario, Florence was paying tribute to the Mongols. Venice had lost its mainland colonies. Genoa was still trading, but no longer as freely as before. Where then would the Renaissance have occurred? Possibly not in Europe at all. The finest craftsmen, architects, mathematicians, and philosophers from conquered lands would have found themselves at Mongol courts, exactly as had already happened in real Persia and real China. Mongol Khans loved to surround themselves with talented people from the peoples they had subdued. Kublai Khan kept Chinese poets, Persian astronomers, and historian theologians at his court. In our scenario, they would have been joined by French sculptors, Italian painters, and Parisian scholastics. Karakorum, already a city where dozens of cultures met, could have become the new center of human thought. A city where ancient Greek philosophy would have encountered Confucianism and Vedic mathematics, where a Persian poet could have spoken with a French theologian, and both would have listened to a Chinese astronomer. This sounds like a utopia, but one must not forget that at the foundation of all this lay a Mongol war machine, tribute, and fear. The beauty of the court did not cancel out the brutality of the conquest. And then the plague came. 1346 to 1353. The Black Death. In real history, it reached Europe through Mongol trade routes, through the Crimea, through Genoese merchants, through the Mediterranean. In our scenario, those same routes existed, but they were far wider, far busier, and connected far more people. The plague would have spread even faster, from Beijing to Lisbon in 2 or 3 years rather than 10. Mongol governors would have died alongside everyone else. The yam stations, where yesterday horses were changed and merchants rested, would have become mass graves. The trade network that had so effectively united the world now spread death with equal efficiency. And after the plague, the beginning of the end of Mongol rule in Europe, because central authority without people, without couriers, without governors is nothing but a word. Local leaders who survived would have begun reclaiming control over their own lands. But these would no longer have been the old feudal barons. They would have been new people of a new era. Merchants enriched by Mongol trade. Military commanders who had learned new tactics from the Mongols themselves. Priests who had reimagined their own role in a world where God had not protected his own church. From these ruins, a new Europe would have been assembled, unrecognizable to us, yet in some ways strangely familiar. Cities no longer under episcopal authority, trading republics instead of feudal kingdoms. Armies that would have fought with mounted archers, learned from the conquerors, rather than with heavy knights who had proven entirely useless. And here comes the most unexpected turn in our entire alternative history. In the real 15th century, it was the Spanish and Portuguese who discovered the Americas. The reason was straightforward. They needed a maritime route to Asia. The overland route through the Middle East was controlled first by the Mongols and then by the Ottoman Turks, making trade with the East increasingly expensive and dangerous. So Portugal sailed around Africa, and Spain sailed west across the Atlantic. But in our scenario, the Ottoman Empire does not exist in that form. The Mongols destroyed its predecessors and maintained control over Anatolia and the Middle East long after the main Mongol state had begun to fragment. The overland route to Asia was open. Expensive, yes, but accessible. And if there was no need to seek a maritime route to the west, Columbus does not sail. Or he sails later. Or he sails, but finds not defenseless peoples with stone weapons, but advanced civilizations that have had several more centuries to develop. Imagine the Aztecs in the year 1700, not 1519, or the Inca in 1800, peoples who had had time to develop metallurgy, the wheel, firearms. Perhaps they had even built ships of their own and already knew of the existence of the Old World long before any encounter with it. The first contact between the Americas and Europe would have unfolded not as a conquest, but as a meeting between equals or near equals. No conquistadores, no mass destruction, none of the genocide that in real history claimed between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of both continents. This is perhaps the greatest single difference between our real world and the one that might have been. Not Mongol tents in Versailles, not the Pope in Palermo, but living, unbroken civilizations of the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca meeting the old world on their own terms. The Mongol conquest of Europe was not simply a story of what would have happened if the wrong side had won. It is the greatest branching point in all of civilizational history, perhaps second only to humanity's first migration out of Africa. The Church loses its monopoly on thought and morality, not through Luther in the 16th century, but through steppe cavalry in the 13th. Feudalism does not fade gradually, but collapses sharply and painfully. And from the ruins, something new and not yet understood begins to rise. The Renaissance still happens, but not in Florence. It happens in Karakorum, where all the great traditions of human thought converge at once. The Americas remain untouched for several more centuries, and their peoples have the chance to become what they were always capable of becoming. Is this world better than ours? That is the wrong question. It is simply different, more brutal in its origins, and perhaps more colorful, more genuinely diverse in what followed. A world without a single dominant center, without a single dominant religion, without a single dominant people at the top of the hierarchy. A world where humanity took a completely different road. And looking at our own road, with its colonialism, its 2 world wars, and its nuclear weapons, it is hard to say with any confidence that the other road would have been the worst one. In that alternative world, perhaps someone is also sitting in front of camera telling the story of a strange alternative history, where the Mongols stopped at Lake Nitsa and a small island on the edge of the Atlantic went on, a few centuries later, to conquer half the planet. Imagine how strange that must sound from over there. If you enjoyed this journey through alternative history, subscribe to the channel. Every week, a new branching point, a new world that could have existed. Next time, we'll talk about what would have happened if Napoleon had won at Waterloo, and whether it would truly have been the happy ending for Europe that the French so love to imagine. Don't miss it.